Nightly News, Monday, March 1st, with John Chancellor and David Brinkley reporting from Boston, Massachusetts.
Good evening from Boston, Massachusetts. Tomorrow, the year's second presidential primary takes place here, and today the air was filled with politics in Massachusetts and in Washington. At the White House, the president told an interviewer that he will no longer use the word détente. Détente is the word used to describe our relations with the Russians, and it has become part of this year's political debate. In our most recent NBC News poll, 64% of those surveyed said they thought the Soviet Union was getting more out of détente than the United States. Here's more on the story from John Cochran in Washington.
President Ford's campaign advisors are concerned that détente has become a political liability for him. Ronald Reagan has repeatedly attacked both détente and the man most closely associated with that policy, Secretary of State Kissinger. Today, in an interview with Richard Whitcomb of Miami station WCKT, Mr. Ford defended Kissinger but said he's dropped the word détente from his vocabulary.
Détente is only a word that was coined. I don't think it's applicable anymore. I think we have to talk about the realities, negotiation for a lowering of the strategic nuclear ballistic capabilities. We ought to talk about trade. We ought to talk about science and those things in an atmosphere where we're dealing from strength and we recognize that others may have some. But we have to have that strength to move ahead.
Mr. Ford was reminded that the Chinese opposed détente with the Russians, but he said he does not think the Chinese tried to embarrass him by inviting Richard Nixon over for a visit. Still, the president gave his most negative appraisal yet of how the Nixon trip affected his own New Hampshire campaign.
Timing, right at the time of the New Hampshire primary, probably had an unsettling impact. People weren't quite sure what was going to happen with the trip, and so I think the timing was very bad from our point of view. Whether the substance of that trip will have any adverse impact in the future, it's a little premature to point out.
Mr. Ford said he will talk to Nixon at some point, but that he will not debrief him on his trip. The president did not seem worried that the Nixon travels will affect the outcome of the Florida primary. Mr. Ford said that although the race there is neck and neck, he expects to win. John Cochran, NBC News, the White House.
There will be 8 Democrats on the presidential primary ballot here tomorrow, and 7 of them were campaigning in Massachusetts today. Jimmy Carter was campaigning in Florida. It is endorsement time here in Boston. Cesar Chavez of the Farm Workers endorsed Sergeant Shriver, and Senator Henry Jackson produced an endorsement from Daniel Patrick Moynihan of Harvard, formerly our ambassador to the UN. Moynihan said if Jackson is elected president, that will be a signal to the Russians, in Moynihan's words, that they've got to start taking the United States seriously. John Hart of our staff has spent the last couple of weeks in Massachusetts watching candidates, and here is what he has learned.
Massachusetts is a state where contentiousness is honored and continued. They're still arguing over whether the revolution began on the bridge at Concord or on the green at Lexington. From Harvard Yard to the factories of this industrial state, from the lobster boats on Cape Ann to the townhouses on Beacon Hill, there is nothing more savored than a good, ragged political fight. That is missing this time, as politics comes neatly packaged in a shadow box. This is the only place most of the people see the candidates. Jimmy Carter spent only half a day here since winning the New Hampshire primary, but he is preceded by more than a month of commercials, running against Washington.
I've been accused of being an outsider, and I plead guilty. I am well and able.
But here, for the first time, he is running against a man who was running against Washington when Carter was still selling peanuts.
When they said bussin', I said no.
Wallace has had the biggest rallies and the most television, where he spent more money than anyone else. Busing is his natural issue, but polls show anti-busing people are strongly supporting all the other candidates, too.
Hold
opponent, there's another Democrat who's catching the eye, the ear, the approval of Democrats and independents. He's not on the left, he's not on the right.
Henry Jackson, in his first primary of the year, is seeking the center of the party. Jackson has the broadest labor support, and he repeats his brave prediction that he will win.
Thank you.
Since the old economics don't work, we're going to have to try some new economics. We're going to have a full employment policy.
Morris Udall has spent 20 days here, and most of his advertising money on newspapers, working on moving up from second in New Hampshire to first in Massachusetts, or at least first again among the liberal candidates.
The one thing I've been fortunate in doing is being able to fight some of those tough battles in the United States Senate that people said couldn't be won.
Birch Bayh has spent more time here than any of them, at least 30 days. But he's short of money, and after coming in a low third in New Hampshire, desperately needs a decent showing here to hang on.
The fundamental issue is privilege.
Fred Harris has spent a lot of time here, too, running against big business and bad government. As always, he is short of money and exposure.
Hope you'll vote for me. Don't forget now. There is no one in the race for the presidency today better trained, better qualified than this man, Sergeant Shriver.
Sergeant Shriver, the only Catholic running in a primary where 70% of the Democrats are Catholic, married to a Kennedy in Kennedy's state, has to do well here. And if he doesn't, is most likely of the also-runs to drop out. Milton Schaap is the least visible one here, campaigning mostly in small gatherings and not at all on television. Millions of words, hundreds of commercials, dozens of slogans have been aimed at the people of Massachusetts. To find out what they'd heard, we went to the Haymarket in Boston, where every kind of citizen comes to shop. The question was, of all the things all the candidates are saying, what is one thing that sticks in your mind?
Not a single thing. You've heard it all before, haven't you?
I think that they're saying so little, it's very hard to remember what they're saying. I think they're saying too much. Well, in a way, it's hard to separate what's important and what's unimportant.
Each fellow is promising much more, I think, than he can deliver.
No, the candidates pretty much look the same to me. There's nothing that any one of them has said so far, except for maybe Wallace, that differentiates one from the others.
I can't believe what they say. I'm sorry. They're all going to give us jobs, but I don't see how. Nothing that any of them have said so far has made an impact on me.
I think the attack on government and the idea that people have lost their confidence in the government, that's the issue that I keep hearing over and over again.
Well, I don't take much interest in candidates and so forth. I just deal with my own problems.
Primaries are for people who still believe that politicians make a difference. We have yet to see that the campaigning in Massachusetts has restored the faith of those who don't, or even got through to them. John Hart, NBC News, Boston.
The Republicans.
The Republican candidates seem to feel that the only state in the Union that voted for McGovern has very little to offer them, and so neither Ford nor Reagan has showed his face here in Massachusetts. Reagan did do a lot of broadcast advertising here in Boston for his New Hampshire campaign, since Boston stations reach over both states, but he has done nothing here since. President Ford did send $200,000 up here for his campaign, but did not appear. And while he did not come himself, he did send money for a sort of campaign by mail order. The prospect is that the money will be enough. Mr. Ford's advantage in being in the White House seems to be substantial, and the new NBC News poll shows a rising public approval of his performance in office. And Massachusetts, they say, is the most liberal state in the Union. It has not voted for any Republican but Eisenhower since 1928. And so it may not be Reagan country. His regional campaign manager says Reagan does not regard this state as crucial. Instead, both he and President Ford are working in Florida, which they do see as crucial, and where, for a Republican, a little political bread cast on the waters is most likely to pay off. John?
And finally, Democratic liberals and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Massachusetts, the only state to vote against Nixon in '72, the most liberal state in the country, the center of academic liberalism in the United States. If there is any place to observe liberal Democrats, it's here. And what do we find? The Democratic liberals are divided without issues or leaders. Their votes will be divided among Bayh, Harris, Schaap, Shriver, and Udall, which means that in Massachusetts tomorrow there won't be a single liberal voice, there will be many. There is also a small but significant movement of liberals to Jimmy Carter. These liberals think Carter is a winner, and if his moderate policies don't match their liberal ideals, well, that's all right with them. One of them said the other day, 8 years of Ford and Nixon are too high a price to pay for ideological purity. Another said, we have got to choose a candidate who appeals to a broad mass of voters. That's not the kind of talk you usually hear from liberals, but this is not a year for liberal causes. The Vietnam War, which mobilized the liberals, is over. The race question is not a cutting issue. Hubert Humphrey and Teddy Kennedy are not running, all of which means that the Democratic liberals, who played such an important role 4 years ago, are now looking for a place on the political stage, and they haven't found it yet. Good night from Boston for NBC News.
With John Chancellor reporting from the NBC News Election Center in Massachusetts.
Good evening from Boston. It was voting day in Massachusetts and Vermont today, where both states in bad weather held presidential primaries. And we have some early returns from Vermont. Among the Democrats, with 19% of the precincts reporting, Jimmy Carter of Georgia had more votes than all the other Democrats on the ballot. It's a small number, but this balance of votes has held steady since the very first returns came in. On the Republican side, President Ford has 2,092 votes. Ronald Reagan is not on the Vermont ballot. His 583 votes tallied so far are all write-ins. The weather was bad throughout the region, and there were reports of low voter turnout in parts of Massachusetts. In Boston, officials said there was a heavy turnout of voters in those parts of the city which had been affected by court-ordered school busing. But in other parts of town and in the suburbs, some voters stayed home because of the snow and icy sleet. And in other parts of the state, the weather was as bad or worse. This did not deter some of the many Democrats running here from pressing the flesh this morning. There are 8 nationally known Democratic presidential hopefuls running in Massachusetts. Not all of them were in the state today, but those who were here were campaigning right down to the wire. The liberal Democrats are all hoping for a good showing. A poor showing in Massachusetts would probably knock some of them out of the race entirely. Among the Democrats, only Scoop Jackson is flatly predicting victory in Massachusetts. Jimmy Carter said he would do well, but did not say he'd come in first. Carter was campaigning in Florida today, and with him was Judy Woodruff.
Carter predicted he will come in well ahead of both Wallace and Jackson in Massachusetts, and said that showing will give him a boost in Florida next week. He told college students in Miami he's for decriminalization of marijuana, and promised an elderly crowd in Fort Myers he will have a top member of his White House staff who represents retired people. Everywhere he went, he repeated his theme that the Florida primary is critical, not as a test of him, but of George Wallace.
This primary next week will determine whether or not Governor Wallace has any possibility at all, which I don't think he does, of being on the Democratic ticket or being elected president. And if he doesn't do at least as well in 76 as he did in 72, it would be a very severe political blow to him. I think I will do well in Florida. If I should come in first in Florida, which I'm not predicting, that would be a tremendous boost to my campaign. It would be very difficult for anyone to defeat me after Florida.
Carter said he's confident he'll hold Wallace below the margin he won here 4 years ago. One indication of how well organized Carter is came from his state campaign manager, who says Carter volunteers will have contacted almost half of Florida's more than 2 million Democratic voters by the day of the primary. Carter says if he wins in Florida, it will be very difficult for anyone to stop him from winning the Democratic nomination. He is visiting 20 Florida cities this week, trying to make that prediction come true. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, Fort Myers, Florida.
What happens in Florida will be in part determined by what happens here in Massachusetts tonight. There are really two Democratic contests going on here. The moderate to conservative field includes Jimmy Carter, who won in the New Hampshire primary, Scoop Jackson and George Wallace. For Jackson and Wallace, this is their first primary. There are 5 liberal Democrats on the ballot here in Massachusetts, and not all are likely to survive today's balloting. The liberals are Birch Bayh, Fred Harris, Milton Schaap, Sargent Shriver, and Morris Udall. In this group, Udall did best in New Hampshire. There's also a Republican contest in Massachusetts. Ronald Reagan has largely ignored the state. His people say they'll consider it a major victory if Reagan gets 35% of the vote. President Ford has not campaigned here, but has spent about $200,000. And his people say it will be close, but they believe that Ford will get more than 50%.
Chancellor reporting from the NBC News Center in New York, and David Brinkley's Journal from Washington.
Good evening. The Democratic Party spent the day today trying to sort itself out following yesterday's Massachusetts primary. Senator Henry Jackson was the winner with 23% of the vote. Congressman Mo Udall was second, the strongest liberal candidate, with 18%. Just nosing out George Wallace, who had 17%. Jimmy Carter was fourth with 14%, a disappointment to him. He hardly campaigned in Massachusetts, but reportedly spent more on TV ads than any other candidate there. Below Carter were Harris, Shriver, Bayh, McCormick, and Schaap. Carter got 16 convention delegates. Udall and Wallace got about 20 each, and Jackson picked up 30 delegates in the primary. Here's the Jackson story reported by Bob Jameson. Well, we don't have the Bob Jameson story right at the moment. We'll try to get it to you later. In any case, the Florida primary comes up next Tuesday, and the tempo of politicking in that state has increased because of the Massachusetts primary. George Wallace was critical about Jimmy Carter, not mentioning him by name today, and Carter was critical of Henry Jackson's performance in Massachusetts, and Carter used Jackson's name. Judy Woodruff has that story.
Carter told reporters in Florida today he overestimated the effect of his New Hampshire victory on Massachusetts voters and said he underestimated the impact of the busing issue, an issue he said Jackson took full advantage of.
Jackson ran a one-issue campaign, which was busing, and it paid off for him.
Carter said he was not accusing Jackson of being a racist, but said Jackson had exploited an issue with racial overtones.
No, I'm not an emotional... I'm not in favor of mandatory busing. But to run my campaign in Massachusetts on an anti-busing issue is just contrary to my basic nature. I didn't do it. I don't intend to. If I have to win by appealing to a basically negative emotional issue which has connotations of racism, I don't care to win that way.
Carter continued with the campaign schedule he had planned for today and said his fourth-place finish in Massachusetts won't hurt him. As for the busing issue, he said he doesn't believe it will be important in the Florida primary next Tuesday. Until now, Carter has said he didn't need to attack his opponents to win votes. Today's criticism of Jackson's campaign tactics apparently means he's changed his mind. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, Cape Canaveral, Florida.
Scoop Jackson today described Carter's accusation on busing as absurd. Jackson's victory in Massachusetts may change the odds in the Florida primary, and we have a report on that story from our correspondent there, Tom Pettit.
The Florida Democratic primary will be tough and perhaps bitter. This had been expected to be a showdown between Carter and Wallace. But Massachusetts changed all that. Now it will be a showdown among Jackson, Wallace, and Carter. Carter will be tougher, finding that a smile and a handshake are not enough. He began his effort to come back by attacking Jackson. Jackson has run an aggressive campaign in Florida and will continue that effort. George Wallace may be the chief beneficiary of the Florida campaign. He predicts he will win. And in fact, Jackson, Carter, and Shapp may so divide up the anti-Wallace vote that it is entirely conceivable that George Wallace could win here in Florida. Tom Pettit, NBC News, at Cape Canaveral.
Congressman Mo Udall of Arizona has come in first among the liberal Democrats now in 2 primaries, New Hampshire and Massachusetts. His next primary run will be in New York, although there is talk that he may campaign in the North Carolina primary later this month. Among the liberals, Udall is now the front runner. Here's more from Charles Quinn.
They were cheering at Morris Udall's headquarters last night, but liberal Democrats in general really had little to cheer about. Collectively, the 5 liberal candidates did poorly in Massachusetts, the only state that went for George McGovern 4 years ago. Only Morris Udall had reason to be happy. For the second straight primary, he was far out in front of the liberal pack. Udall held a news conference in New York City today, and he had a simple message.
I'm saying that the chances now of stopping Carter, Wallace, and Jackson rest on my shoulders. I'm the only show that's left in town. If we're going to have a progressive candidate in 1976, it's going to be Mo Udall, and I would hope that the supporters of Birch Bayh and the other candidates would come around to that point of view.
Bayh was a prime target. He got only 5% of the Massachusetts vote. He went back to Washington today to decide whether to end his campaign. A close advisor said there was no other decision he could make than to drop out. Sergeant Shriver ran a distant 6th in a state where his supporters had hoped he would do well because of his connection with the Kennedys. Senator Edward Kennedy's sister Eunice is his wife. Shriver said he hasn't decided whether to continue. Fred Harris had said repeatedly that he had to come in among the top 3 in both New Hampshire and Massachusetts. He finished a poor 4th in New Hampshire, a poor 5th in Massachusetts, but he said he would not give up.
We can keep going because we have made a strong showing here, a solid showing, and also because the people who are deeply involved in the campaign here and around the country feel that we must. So do I.
Udall did some street campaigning in New York City today. He said he hoped to make what he called a major maximum effort in New York's primary next month.
New York primary, 6th of April. Great. Give us a hand.
The Massachusetts results indicated Udall is operating from a very narrow base of support. Upper middle income, suburban, liberal, college-educated, white. Some analysts believe that he must broaden that support if he is to win the Democratic nomination for president. Charles Quinn, NBC News, New York.
The Massachusetts returns, plus our NBC News surveys, indicate that it may be tough for a liberal candidate this year. The one reason is that the Vietnam War is over. In Massachusetts, the former anti-war vote was smaller, and it was also scattered among several candidates. We also learned that the 2 Southerners running in Massachusetts appealed to different groups. Jimmy Carter of Georgia won the black vote in Boston, probably because he'd been endorsed by Martin Luther King Sr., while George Wallace of Alabama won handily in places where school busing was a heated issue. Scoop Jackson's position on busing helped him too, but he did well in many categories: good with liberals, better with moderates, best with conservatives. Also, our surveys show that those Republicans who voted for Gerald Ford had more trust in him than Reagan voters had in their candidate. And here are the final results of that Republican contest. 26,000 votes, 84% for Gerald Ford. Just under 5,000 votes, 16% for Ronald Reagan. I think some of those figures are not right, but the percentages are. Neither campaigned in Massachusetts, but Mr. Ford spent about $200,000 in the state. We'll have more news in a minute. And now we're going back for that report from Bob Jameson on the latest in the campaign of Senator Henry Jackson. Here it is.
The applause this morning was for Henry Jackson, but he thought these campaign workers should have been applauding for themselves, because it was the Jackson organization, fashioned of smart old pals, bright young men, and several thousand union members that won him Massachusetts. Running things here was Bill Ezekiel, a 27-year-old Irishman who learned his politics on the streets of South Boston. He was helped by Jackson's savvy national campaign staff and by $450,000 of campaign funds. And by people like Fred Langone, a Boston city councilman whose politics have been confined to the wards since John F. Kennedy ran for president. Langone is old politics, and until Henry Jackson came along, nobody on the national level wanted his help. There were dozens of Langones in the campaign, each with friends and old favors to collect. And there was labor, uneasy with Jimmy Carter, figuring that now was the time to get behind their old congressional ally, Jackson. While all these things were gelling, Jackson worked tirelessly, spending 20 days in the state, campaigning from morning to night, seeking the blue-collar vote and the ethnic vote, stressing he would bring jobs and ease unemployment, making an old liberals appeal for policies and support of the kind that elected Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson. While he did that, his organization, through phone banks, volunteers, and polls, identified the Jackson vote, and they planned a massive get-out-the-vote effort, as though, one coordinator said, there would be a blizzard election day. Yesterday, there wasn't a blizzard, but it was close. City Councilman James Michael Connolly, co-chairman of the Jackson campaign.
Well, I think organizational superiority was the difference in the fight. Because of the fact that Jackson had poll workers scattered throughout the state, the fact that Jackson had a means of getting them to the polls, the fact that Jackson had telephones going continually until the poll was closed, that sort of thing made a difference.
When Jackson claimed victory last night, there was a lot of surprise in Boston. But not among the old politicians who have been winning elections that way here for years. Bob Jameson, NBC News, Boston.
Ronald Reagan broke the 11th commandment. The 11th commandment says, "Thou shalt not speak ill of a fellow Republican." And Ronald Reagan has up to now carefully followed that precept. But today, with the Florida primary election less than a week away, Reagan followed the advice of some of his Florida supporters and went on the offensive against Gerald Ford, Henry Kissinger, and the foreign policy of the Ford administration. Reagan said his attack wasn't a violation of the 11th commandment, but it was highly and personally critical of Gerald Ford. Don Oliver reports from Florida.
Back in Florida, ready to go on the attack. He knows that he has to reach out for Republican voters who might just vote for President Ford simply because he is president. Reagan has to convince those voters that Ford is doing a bad job. So in new, tough language, Reagan told a news conference that Ford does not deserve to be president because he and Henry Kissinger have mismanaged military affairs and foreign policy.
Under Kissinger and Ford, this nation has become number 2 in military power in a world where it's dangerous, if not fatal, to be second best. Along with the 93rd and 94th Congress, the Ford-Kissinger leadership must be held accountable to history for allowing this to happen. What has the United States gotten in return, other than Soviet belligerence in the Middle East, Soviet duplicity in Southeast Asia, and Soviet imperialism in South Central Africa? Mr. Ford and Dr. Kissinger ask us to trust their leadership. Well, I find that more and more difficult to do. Henry Kissinger's recent stewardship of U.S. foreign policy has coincided precisely with the loss of United States military superiority. Despite Mr. Ford's evident decency, honor, and patriotism, he has shown neither the vision nor the leadership necessary to halt and reverse the diplomatic and military decline of the United States.
Reagan's strategy could be somewhat dangerous. It could be a backlash among Florida Republicans who think that Jerry Ford is a nice guy, and they might resent any attacks on his ability. But Reagan's advisors think he has to take that chance, go on the attack, if he is going to salvage a victory in the Florida primary. Don Oliver, NBC News, Orlando, Florida.
At the White House, Press Secretary Ron Nessen said the president's record in national defense is so well known that no response to Reagan was needed. Here's more on the presidency and politics from Tom Brokaw.
President Ford knew all day that the Reagan attack was coming, but he didn't mention it. Instead, he got in some Florida campaigning without leaving the White House when a Fort Lauderdale group was invited to a Rose Garden ceremony. The president received a towel and other promotional material from the organization, which comes from one of Florida's important Republican counties. White House officials figure this keeps Mr. Ford in a presidential setting and out of a potentially damaging debate with Reagan. So Miami television viewers will see this picture of a friendly, hospitable president, while in the northern part of the state, Jacksonville voters will be able to hear the president's views in the third exclusive Florida television interview he has granted in a week. At a White House Medal of Honor ceremony later, shortly before Reagan opened his Florida news conference, the president did discuss American relations with Russia, but avoided the word détente.
Our policy for America's security can best be summarized in three simple words of the English language: peace through strength. We will win by patient and persistent pursuit of defenses second to none in a world that knows that America says what it means and means what it says.
Tomorrow, the president opens a campaign swing in Illinois, site of the next presidential primary after the Florida contest. He had hoped to tell Illinois farmers that the Russians have bought another major load of American grain, but that deal still is in negotiation, so he can't announce it. Tom Brokaw, NBC News at the White House.
Senator Birch Bayh dropped out of active contention for the Democratic presidential nomination today. He was a victim of poor showings in the New Hampshire and Massachusetts primaries. Bayh came in third in New Hampshire and finished seventh in a 9-way race this week in Massachusetts. Catherine Mackin has the details.
Bayh came to New York last night for a farewell party with his campaign staff. More of that kind of crowd and more of that kind of support might have saved him from the humiliating defeat he took in the Massachusetts primary, a defeat that drove him from the race for the presidency. But at a press conference this morning, Bayh blamed a lack of money, not a lack of votes, for the decision to end his campaign, and he refused to endorse any of the other Democrats still running.
I have decided to suspend my candidacy, not because I wouldn't like to be president, but because we just don't have the dollars necessary to do the job. I think it's premature for me to endorse anyone. I don't like to throw my weight around. I am urging those in New York to take a role, to play a role, and certainly since I thought they had the good judgment to support my candidacy in the first place, I think they have the good judgment to make the right decision for themselves in the second place.
Bayh said he is not endorsing any other Democrats because he wants to keep his own political options open for now. Bayh's status as an inactive candidate really is a technical matter. He did not formally withdraw because his legal advisors felt that if he did, he would be declared ineligible for any more federal campaign funds, and he needs that money to pay his campaign debts. But in fact, the Bayh presidential campaign is finished. It died because he simply never found a political constituency to vote for him. Catherine Mackin, NBC News, New York.
Spring campaign back on the track in Illinois, which has a primary election week after next. The moderates and conservative Democrats were in Florida. Scoop Jackson said he'd compare his civil rights record any day with Jimmy Carter. Carter said George Wallace has a bad record as governor of Alabama, and Wallace said he doesn't know where Carter stands on the issues. Actually, the records of both Carter and Wallace as governor have become part of the political debate this year. We asked our reporter, Kenley Jones, to have a look at the controversy over Wallace's record as governor, and here's what he learned.
We have a good state. It's not perfect. We don't have a utopian state, but neither does anyone else. But Alabama's quality of life is good, and it's a good place to live.
If your income is high and you can afford to own a home like one of these, you may agree that Alabama is a good place to live. Property taxes in Alabama are the lowest in the nation. No need to worry about them, even if you own a mansion. The state's personal income tax is a flat 5% after the first $5,000, no matter how much more money you make. The ceiling on corporate taxes is also set at 5%. But 2/3 of Alabama's tax revenue comes from sales taxes, the taxes that place the heaviest burden on those least able to pay, middle and low-income families, the people George Wallace says he stands for. Neither food nor medicine is exempt from sales taxes in Alabama. Most Alabamians pay 6% on everything they buy, including necessities. One of the planks in Wallace's presidential platform is tax reform, but he has made few efforts to reform Alabama's tax structure to make it less regressive. Wallace's argument is that taxes are so low in Alabama that they are not a burden for anyone to pay. But the low tax yield has been a burden on some state departments which are expected to provide state services. Alabama ranks 48th in the nation in its expenditures per pupil in the public schools. exactly where it was when Wallace first became governor. Yet instead of asking for a tax raise to help balance the budget last year, Wallace took money from the state's education fund. Wallace has managed to establish a respectable system of vocational schools during his administration. But when the students enter the job market, they find that Alabama remains one of 10 states that do not have a state minimum wage law. Just a few blocks from the state capitol in Montgomery is the federal courthouse, and the office of the man who some say has done more to govern Alabama than Wallace, U.S. District Judge Frank Johnson. Johnson says the federal court has had to intervene in Alabama frequently because state officials have refused to carry out their constitutional duties. It was Johnson who ordered Alabama's legislature reapportioned and its schools integrated. He also ordered an end to discrimination against blacks in the hiring of state troopers. Several years ago, Johnson ordered the state to upgrade its antiquated mental health hospitals. The state is still under the court order and has begun a program of building regional facilities to improve conditions and eliminate overcrowding. Johnson has also ordered a review of property tax assessment to eliminate inequities. One result may be to broaden the tax base. Johnson says the state has attempted to provide public services which are so inadequately funded that they have forced some citizens to live in inhumane and hazardous conditions. In his most recent decision involving Alabama, Johnson ordered the state to upgrade its prisons to eliminate overcrowding. Wallace charged that the judge wanted to create a hotel atmosphere for prisoners. One of the most frequent criticisms of Wallace is that he is more interested in running for office than he is in running the office once he gets elected. His preoccupation with his presidential campaigns has reduced his influence with state legislators, whose support he needs to pass his programs. For example, last spring, Wallace called a special session of the legislature to propose 8 bills to regulate utility companies and to hold down utility rates to consumers, but not one of the bills passed. Wallace has a ready answer for criticism of his administration.
The people of this state are intelligent people. Now, if they were not having the type of government in Alabama and the type of progress that they thought was good, they would not have elected the governor of Alabama, who is me, the 3rd time. And that ought to answer that, and that's all I have to say about it.
It is difficult to find fault with Wallace's argument. Despite Alabama's low ranking in many state services, the people have continued to elect him governor. But now Wallace is running for president, not governor, and voters in the rest of the country will have to decide whether what has been good enough for Alabama is good enough for them. Ken Lee Jones, NBC News, Montgomery.
President Ford took his campaign today to farm country and to Lincoln country in Springfield, Illinois. The president, in what was almost an aside, answered Ronald Reagan's criticism of his foreign policy. Mr. Ford said his record speaks for itself. His reason for being in farm country was to court farmers for their votes in the Illinois primary the week after next. Tom Brokaw reports.
President Ford opened his Illinois tour on what is hallowed ground for Republican presidential candidates, the front porch of Abraham Lincoln's Springfield home. The president's campaign advisors are confident he'll survive the latest attacks from Ronald Reagan. In fact, his Illinois chairman said Mr. Ford would carry this state with 60% of the vote. However, the Ford campaign is worried about the Illinois farm vote, so this afternoon, Mr. Ford concentrated on agricultural issues. President Ford campaigned hard for the Illinois farm vote, talking about grain sales and a major new tax proposal. He wants to raise the exemption on inheritance taxes from $60,000 to $150,000. That would make it easier to pass along family farms from one generation to the next. And Mr. Ford had hoped to tell these farmers of another grain sale to Russia, but the deal hasn't been completed. So he promoted détente by saying there would be more sales, and he promised not to withhold grain.
Well, I admit that there are a number of people in political life, and some of them are candidates for the presidency, who have indicated that they would use food to try to change a social system in another country, and in the process would stop exporting, and in the process would have you store your grain rather than sell it. I categorically disagree with the person or persons who advocate that policy.
White House officials figure it would be tough for Ronald Reagan to counter that answer in central Illinois. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, with President Ford on the campaign trail in Springfield, Illinois.
Carter said Jackson deliberately distorted his record and criticized Jackson's TV ads. Last night, we took a look at George Wallace's record as governor of Alabama. Tonight, we'll take a look at Carter's record as governor of Georgia. Our guide is Judy Woodruff.
10 years ago, Carter described himself as a conservative. When he ran for governor in 1970, he said he would invite Alabama Governor George Wallace to speak in Georgia. Once in office, Carter never extended the invitation.
Yeah, sure did. That I will faithfully execute the office of governor of Georgia.
Once in office, Carter pledged to end discrimination.
I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
In 1972, as governor of Georgia, he supported a constitutional amendment to prohibit court-ordered busing. Now, Carter's 8-year-old daughter attends an integrated school. He still is against court-ordered busing, but he no longer favors an amendment to prohibit it.
Do solemnly swear.
Carter also appointed blacks and women to a number of important government positions. While his stands on civil rights have received the most national attention, Carter talks most about his reorganization of state government.
When I went into office, we had 300 agencies, departments, bureaus, commissions. 300. We abolished 278.
Many agencies were not actually abolished, despite Carter's claim. Their functions were transferred and put under other larger agencies. Carter says reorganization and budget reforms combined to save Georgia $50 million a year. Actually, the state budget increased by $500 million, or 58%, during Carter's term in office. And the number of state employees rose by 24%.
It's the biggest conglomerate mess you've ever seen in your life. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. As a matter of fact, I don't think either hand knows what it's doing itself. I think reorganization has cost us many, many millions of dollars and is going to continue to cost us many millions of dollars until we do something to eliminate some of the fiascos that he created.
Carter says he saved money in administrative areas and spent it in people areas. For example, spending increased dramatically during his administration in health services for the poor, child care, care of the mentally ill, prison rehabilitation, and drug treatment. It also increased in the area of conservation. Another aspect of a public official's performance is his style, his method of dealing with the people around him. Many say Jimmy Carter left the governor's office with almost as many enemies as he did friends.
My 1973 budget proposal.
They say Carter was unable to persuade the legislature to pass his consumer protection program, for example, because of his relationship with legislators and members of the business community.
Elected officers.
He tried to run the state of Georgia like he did a submarine when he was a submarine commander. He was supposed to give orders and everybody else was supposed to follow it, regardless of what they or their constituents thought. State government doesn't work that way. He had no spirit of compromise about him at all. He was right, everybody else was wrong.
He can be a very stubborn man, and he can be a very uncompromising individual. But he does his homework extremely well. He gets all of his facts before he makes certain proposals. And they're very hard for our department heads then to rebuttal.
Some say Carter often refused to negotiate and disregarded the feelings of people who worked for him. In fact, he did have a domineering style that offended some people and partially hurt his effectiveness. Others praise him for being sensitive to the needs of the poor and the afflicted. In fact, he did initiate a number of progressive, humane programs. Both qualities go to make up Jimmy Carter's character, a character coming under increasing national scrutiny. Judy Woodruff, NBC News.
Tom Chancellor reporting from Florida.
Good evening from Orlando. The Florida presidential primary campaign was coming to an end today, and from Pensacola to Key West, men who would be president were asking Floridians for their votes. 5 candidates were campaigning in a total of 14 Florida cities today, 4 Democrats and 1 Republican, Ronald Reagan. Reagan is not favored to win in tomorrow's balloting. Today he said he doesn't expect to lose, but that if he does, it won't make any difference. Reagan said the final fight will be waged at the Republican National Convention. And Reagan continued to hammer away at Gerald Ford's policies. Tom Brokaw has the story of the Republican campaign.
Ronald Reagan closed his Florida campaign with a stepped-up attack on President Ford, criticizing not just his foreign policy and economic plan, but also his campaign tactics.
They have done their best to try and convince the people in the primary states that there is no difference between us, that he and I think exactly alike, and therefore, why change the status quo? Well, I think as long as they made that an issue, I have a right to correct what is a misstatement of fact.
Ronald Reagan is scrambling in the final hours of the Florida campaign, trying to keep this state from turning into a disaster. Reagan was expected to do very well among Florida's conservative Republicans. Originally, his campaign manager publicly predicted a 2-to-1 victory.
After more than 20 days of personal campaigning in Florida, Reagan's lead has disappeared. He now says it's a horse race. And as a result, Ronald Reagan is in trouble in Florida, possibly deep trouble.
President Ford spent only 4 days in the state, but each of the days was testimony to the enormous built-in power of the presidency in a campaign. Trouble with Cuban refugee voters around Miami? No problem. Attack Fidel Castro.
The Fidel Castro regime of Cuba, by sending an expeditionary force of 12,000 soldiers to intervene in a civil war in Angola, is acting as an international outlaw.
After his New Hampshire primary victory, President Ford was able to come into Florida not just as an accidental president, but as a winner, and that was an important psychological factor.
The President of the United States.
When he returned to Washington, President Ford remained in Florida on radio and television news programs and on commercials that concentrated on the state's sizable block of Social Security recipients.
WINZ News at your side.
Fact: the president has recommended catastrophic health insurance for everyone covered by Medicare.
It appears that President Ford was able to hold the older voters. Older voters, as a rule, don't like change, and change is what Ronald Reagan was preaching. So, his early lead gone, Reagan came back to Florida a final time with a series of attacks on administration foreign policy.
Mr. Ford, who a few weeks ago said no one can forsake détente and get elected, now tells us that he's going to abandon the word, but retain the policy. The time has come to tell the American people the plain, blunt, hard truth. Mr. Ford and Dr. Kissinger ask us to trust their leadership. Well, I find that more and more difficult to do.
President Ford, so confident of Florida that he went campaigning for the next primary in Illinois, called Reagan's charges Cold War rhetoric.
Any of these people that challenge us in these kind of day-to-day negotiations, issue by issue, problem by problem, haven't been in the ball game. They have lots of rhetoric, but I don't think they understand the problems.
Nevertheless, Reagan continued the challenges today and insisted that even if he loses tomorrow, he'll go on to other primaries. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, on the campaign trail in Florida.
One other item, an audio tape has been made available to Florida radio stations of a prominent woman urging people to vote in tomorrow's primary. She does not mention any candidate. Her message is nonpartisan, but her name is Betty Ford. We'll have the story of the Democrats in Florida in a minute. The Democratic campaign in the Florida primary has produced a certain amount of bickering among the candidates. Jimmy Carter, Scoop Jackson, and George Wallace all have been trading criticism of one another. Governor Milton Schaap of Pennsylvania, who is also on the ballot, hasn't been especially critical of the other Democrats, but Carter Jackson and Wallace have been fighting each other, and they were still at it today, the final day of the campaign. Tom Pettit has spent the last couple of weeks here in Florida watching candidates, and here is his report on the Democrats.
On election eve here in Florida, the air is filled with political predictions, and the airwaves, both television and radio, are filled with competing political commercials.
Vote Wallace March 9th. Vote Champ for president in the Democratic primary. Elect Senator Scoop Jackson while there's still time to save the 70s.
Then vote for me, Jimmy Carter.
What you are now seeing is not a Jackson commercial. It is Jackson in Miami Beach, bragging about his victory in Massachusetts.
State, all of the candidates were in that race. Scoop Jackson came out a sweeping first, carrying the whole.
Jackson had hoped for some momentum in Florida after Massachusetts, but he had been doing poorly here, and now he would settle for a respectable third place. The man he defeated so badly in Massachusetts, Jimmy Carter, accused Jackson of exploiting the busing issue in Boston.
It's a divisive issue. It's a very emotional issue, and it has racial connotations.
He's implying that I am a segregationist. I am the one who has a 100% civil rights voting record. He doesn't have a 100% civil rights record or any real kind of civil rights record.
The man I nominate is a man who...
Ironically, at the Democratic Convention of 72, Mr. Carter nominated Jackson to be president.
I nominate as our president a great man from the state of Washington, Senator Henry Scoop Jackson.
Now, 4 years later, Carter is finding that a smile alone is not enough. Carter knows he must campaign harder than ever if that is possible for him. He may be the most energetic campaigner in America, second only to Hubert Humphrey. And his organization here is among the best of all the Democratic candidates.
Election day. And Florida is in a special case, the largest state so far, a crucial race between myself and Governor Wallace.
4 years ago, Wallace spoke at the Miami Beach Convention after winning the Florida primary that year. Four years later, Wallace was back in the same convention hall.
But I am here in 1976 to take up where I left off in 1972. Here we go, White House, here we go!
George Wallace is campaigning very hard. His support is very hard. Whether he can win again will affect his future. If he wins instead of Jimmy Carter, that will affect Carter's future. Milton Schaap, the fourth candidate, is not claiming he can beat anybody, but he will get some of the anti-Wallace vote. And Jimmy Carter, who had counted on beating Wallace here, now is running for his political life. And he is using what used to be a Wallace tactic, complaining that the Democratic establishment is ganging up on him.
A lot of the insiders in Washington have said Jimmy Carter has got to be stopped. But I want to tell you that there's no way to stop me.
Both Carter and Jackson are courting the anti-Wallace vote. So, if Carter should somehow win the Florida primary tomorrow, he would regain his status as front runner. But if Jackson gets enough votes away from Carter, then both would lose, and Wallace would win. Tom Pettit, NBC News, on the campaign trail in Florida. So, here's where we stand in Florida with the election tomorrow. Many political observers now say that Gerald Ford could beat Ronald Reagan. On the Democratic side, it looks as though the race between Jimmy Carter and George Wallace is close. Scoop Jackson's position is less clear, but many observers think he will not do as well as Wallace or the others. We don't know for sure, of course, but we will know tomorrow night. In a minute, Edwin Newman in New York will have more news. Especially in Florida, David, about 1/3 of the Republicans here are on Social Security. But that's not the only group politicians in Florida must worry about. There are others, and they demand certain rituals. Tom Pettit has been looking into this aspect of Florida politics.
It is obligatory for candidates to seek out older people. Florida voters on the average are the oldest voters in the whole country. One-fourth of all Republicans here are over 65. One-fifth of all Democrats here are over 65.
The system must be strengthened.
You can see why Social Security is so important in this state, which, after all, is the place Ponce de Leon looked for the legendary fountain of youth.
And I'm proud to have him.
3/4 of the voters here are not retired. But for the senior citizens, politics is a form of entertainment in their otherwise limited lives. Collins Avenue, Miami Beach, headquarters of the Jewish population. Candidates must be pro-Israel. Definitely pro-Israel. Decidedly pro-Israel. Determined to be pro-Israel. But Jews make up only 8% of the Florida vote, total, for both parties.
And that you will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Even the carefully cultivated Cuban-American vote is small, just 3%, split equally between the two parties.
Foreign or domestic.
The biggest black vote of all feels it is being ignored. 15% of the Florida population is black.
Wallace, Carter, and also Jackson hasn't been out here. None of those candidates have been out here to say one word to the public. I don't know why.
I don't know. What can they be scared of? We can't do nothing to them.
Everybody's scared of the ghetto.
Jackson has attended many black meetings, and Carter has opened offices in black neighborhoods, but none of this seems to sink in.
Well, then they're not looking where we are. They have to come over here. Feel this.
There seems to be a certain being down on the black issues. They are not for them, they're not addressing them, and it's not the popular thing. It's not black time.
It is white time here. Florida is almost 90% white. If you add up all the people who are white, Protestant, and not yet retired, you have the biggest black vote of all, 50%. If you get them, that is how you win elections in Florida. Tom Pettit, NBC News, on the campaign trail in Florida.
Looking at. Among the Democrats, Jimmy Carter won with 34%. George Wallace's final percentage was 31%, and Henry Jackson placed a respectable third with 24%, still very much in the race, and we'll see him again in the New York primary next month. On the Republican side, Gerald Ford won 53% of the vote, Ronald Reagan 47%. That is the second primary Reagan has lost to Ford in a head-to-head contest. There's another one-on-one Republican contest in Illinois next week, and Reagan was campaigning there today. With him was our man, Don Oliver.
This morning, Reagan professed to still be delighted by the results in Florida. As his campaign bus rolled through Illinois, he read a news summary, while his aides tried to convince reporters the Reagan campaign is making good progress. They say he would have lost by a wider margin in Florida if he hadn't attacked the U.S. defense posture and Ford's foreign policy. They say the issues are catching on. Reagan maintains that even in losing, he is picking up more convention delegates than he had projected.
As long as you're ahead of your projections, then you have to assume that your judgment about how many delegates you could count on by convention time must be accurate. If you begin falling way behind and not getting as many out of a state as you thought you'd get, that's a different matter. But so far, we're ahead.
To his first crowd of the day, Reagan repeated his pledge that he is in the race to stay.
In my mind, against an incumbent president getting 48% of the vote in New Hampshire and getting 47% of the vote in Florida does not mean that you fold your tent and silently steal away.
The Reagan people have put together a scenario that goes something like this. Reagan gets 40% of the vote in Illinois. He goes on to take a great number of delegates in the non-primary state conventions. Then he wins in the North Carolina primary. After that, they hope to win primaries in the South and in the Mountain West. That is the strategy that they have put together. That's what they think they can do, and that's why Reagan is staying in the race. Don Oliver, NBC News, Ottawa, Illinois.
Our surveys in Florida indicate that Reagan did not win there because some Republicans thought his positions were too extreme. Others were worried about his stand on Social Security. And his attacks on President Ford didn't help him. Gerald Ford won in Florida because of his incumbency, plus a lot of money and a good organization. Jimmy Carter won the Florida Democratic primary because he put together an interesting coalition from black voters, from women, and from young people. Carter was campaigning in Illinois today, and our correspondent with him was Judy Woodruff.
Carter gave the credit to a strong organization and hundreds of enthusiastic volunteers. He has now accomplished two of his original goals, winning a primary outside his native South in New Hampshire, and now beating George Wallace on the site of his big victory in 1972.
One of the things that several of the news people have asked me tonight is if this is a sign of a new South. Yes. And I replied, it's not only a sign of a new South, it's a sign of a new America.
An analysis showed Carter was able to capitalize on an anti-Washington sentiment among Florida voters. Today, Carter moved his campaign to the next primary state, Illinois. He says he believes he will do well here, even though the race is complicated by a bitter feud within the Illinois Democratic Party. Both Chicago Mayor Richard Daley and Governor Dan Walker are trying to control the delegates Illinois will send to the convention. Carter says it will be difficult to compete with them, but he does expect to win a large number of popular votes, and he predicts after the Florida results, Wallace will be his major rival here.
And Wallace is going to make a major effort here to redeem himself next week. I don't have any fear of Governor Wallace. I'm not running an anti-Wallace campaign, but I think he will continue on as a candidate.
Carter predicted once again he has a good chance at a first ballot victory at the Democratic Convention. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, Chicago.
One reason for Carter's success in Florida is that he did very well with Democrats who were born either in Florida or in another southern state. That strengthens Carter's contention that he beat Alabama's George Wallace in a southern contest. Our surveys also show that health was a factor in Wallace's defeat in Florida, and that subject came up in Illinois, where Wallace is campaigning today. Kenley Jones reports.
When Wallace arrived at a Union Hall in a Chicago suburb last night to kick off his Illinois campaign, he had already lost in Florida. But he told a cheering crowd of about 1,500 supporters that the defeat is only a temporary setback.
We will go to the convention with a block of delegates that will be as many as any candidate will go with, and as a consequence, we will do well.
One of the reasons Wallace did not do as well as he expected in Florida is that many voters said they believe his health is questionable.
I'm sorry that I am in the wheelchair, and I don't think anybody ought to vote for me on account of the fact that I had an assassination attempt made upon me. That's no reason to vote for anyone for the presidency. But on the other hand, it's not any reason to vote against you if your general health is good and some of the best doctors in the country say so.
Today, almost as if to prove that he is as healthy as any other candidate, Wallace spoke in a cold rain to about 100 supporters who came to an airport rally in Champaign. He told them he is still a viable candidate, to use his words. The Illinois primary is divided into delegate selection and what is sometimes called a beauty contest to determine the popularity of the presidential candidates at the polls.
For Wallace, it's a case of beauty and the beast. He desperately needs a win here, even though it is just a beauty contest, or he may find himself turning into that beast that haunts all politicians, the chronic loser. Kenley Jones, NBC News, with the Wallace campaign in Champaign, Illinois.
The Illinois primary takes place next Tuesday, and both Ronald Reagan and President Ford were in Illinois today. The president was asked about former President Nixon's assertion that there are certain circumstances when national security is involved when the president can take actions which would be illegal for a private citizen. Mr. Ford said he disagrees with Nixon's statement and that he plans to do nothing illegal. He was asked about Secretary of State Kissinger's criticism of politicians who criticized the administration's foreign policy. The president defended Kissinger. Tom Brokaw is with the Ford campaign, and here is his report.
President Ford defended his foreign policy and Henry Kissinger during speeches in the Chicago area today, appearing first at Wheaton College, evangelist Billy Graham's alma mater. When asked about Kissinger's future in his administration, the president was unequivocal in his answer.
I think our foreign policy is moving forward constructively. And under those circumstances, I would not, under any circumstances, want Henry Kissinger to quit, period.
Later, President Ford came before the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations to defend his administration's foreign policy. Again, he used the phrase peace through strength as a substitute for détente.
And today, the president raised some doubts about the prospects for a second-stage arms agreement with the Russians, SALT II. In the past, he has said there will be a SALT II. Today, he was not as certain.
As you know, we are still negotiating the details of such an agreement. And I cannot say when or even whether this will be completed. And I will say also without hesitation that I will never agree to any such treaty or submit it to the United States Senate for ratification unless I am totally convinced that it is in the best interest of the United States and of the peace of the world.
The president also said he's sorry that foreign policy has become an issue in the primaries. He said it could raise questions among allies about where America is going, and it could tempt enemies. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, with the president in Chicago.
Out of the race for the Democratic presidential nomination today, Schaap has done poorly in the primaries, and in Florida, he came in with a lower percentage than the vote tallied in the no preference category. Schaap's decision leaves 6 nationally known Democrats still in the running. He says he won't even campaign in the Pennsylvania primary. And upon learning of this, Senator Henry Jackson decided to abandon his campaign in North Carolina and concentrate on Pennsylvania and New York. Our man Bob Jameson has been following this story, and here is his report.
Jackson and Schaap talked several times in the last 3 weeks. Yesterday, they spoke face-to-face in the old Senate office building in Washington. Schaap also talked yesterday with Hubert Humphrey and with Auto Workers President Leonard Woodcock. But there are strong denials Schaap was pushed out of the race. Everyone says the Pennsylvania governor jumped all on his own. For weeks, however, party leaders in Pennsylvania, most of them solidly behind Jackson, urged Schaap to withdraw. At the same time, Jackson was setting up an organization of his own there, and today, Jackson said he believes a substantial number of Schaap delegates will come over to him. So he withdrew from the North Carolina primary to make his stand in New York and then Pennsylvania. In New York, he has organization, money, and support from the political establishment. And in Pennsylvania now, he has a leg up on both Carter and Udall. Jackson believes they will now have no choice but to run in those states, and Jackson believes he will win both, while Carter and Udall deplete their already scarce campaign treasuries. So, no matter why Milton Schaap withdrew, Henry Jackson tonight is delighted that it happened. Bob Jameson, NBC News.
On the ballot here in the Illinois presidential primary tomorrow will be the names of 6 nationally known politicians, 4 Democrats and 2 Republicans. Ronald Reagan has finished his campaigning here and is in California, and his Republican opponent, Gerald Ford, was campaigning in Washington. John Cochran has that story.
The White House said the president's speech to the nation's mayors, including some from Illinois, was strictly non-political. Ronald Reagan said it was an example of using the presidency for political purposes. Whatever it was, it gave Mr. Ford the chance to repeat a favorite campaign theme, that he favors revenue sharing and other programs which let local officials spend federal money.
When you were put in charge, you proved, as I knew you would, that you know a lot more about what your cities need than the Washington bureaucracy does.
At his next officially non-political meeting, Mr. Ford received an award from the Ohio Farm Bureau for his work in improving the economy. The president used the occasion to remind his audience that the latest figures show reductions in unemployment and inflation. Mr. Ford next turned to foreign affairs at the swearing-in of the new U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, William Scranton. The president is aware that some of his party's conservatives are concerned that Scranton will not be as outspoken as the man he replaces, Daniel Moynihan. But the president said Scranton will be a tough defender of American interests.
Later, the president returned to his office for some campaigning in private away from news cameras. He telephoned campaign workers in Illinois, urging them to keep working and warning them not to get overconfident. John Cochran, NBC News, the White House. President Ford is widely regarded as the winner here in Illinois. Ronald Reagan says he'll be satisfied with 40% of the vote and a share of the delegates. Ford spent 4 days campaigning in Illinois. Reagan spent 11. Don Oliver has been covering Reagan in the primaries, and here is his report on the contest in Illinois.
The question was asked over and over again in Illinois last week. Why is Ronnie still running? 2 primary defeats and another one looming tomorrow. The critics say, shouldn't that be enough for Reagan to step aside, throw his support to Gerald Ford, and let the Republican Party concentrate on defeating the Democrats in November? Reagan doesn't see it that way, and perhaps there is some logic to his reasoning. He has certainly not been eliminated mathematically in the delegate selection process. He has come close in 2 states, indicating there are quite a few Republicans who would like to see the incumbent turned out.
We want Reagan!
And there are still nearly 5 months before the Republican convention. 5 months in which a sudden downturn in the economy, a severe setback in foreign policy, or some other unforeseen event could change the whole race. It is a long shot, and Reagan, the man who said months ago that he wanted to do nothing to hurt the Republican Party's chances in November, is running the risk of splitting the party by continuing his candidacy.
Something like
But Reagan is prepared to take that risk, believing it would be premature to quit, saying,
there won't be any folding of my tent and slipping away. I'm in this all the way to Kansas City.
Reagan knows that he is going to lose in Illinois. He'd like to be done with it and hope that somewhere in the future there will be a brighter day. Don Oliver, NBC News, Los Angeles.
We'll finish shaking hands in just a few minutes.
One cloud on President Ford's horizon is the affair of Howard Bo Callaway. Last week, NBC News and the Denver Post disclosed that there's an investigation underway of possible political pressure Callaway may have used to get the federal government to expand a ski resort he owns. Following that disclosure, Callaway suspended himself as Ford's campaign manager. As far as we can tell, however, the Callaway affair is having no effect on the Ford campaign here in Illinois. We'll have more on the Illinois primary in a moment. On the Democratic ballot, there will be 4 names in the Illinois primary: Jimmy Carter, Fred Harris, Sargent Shriver, and George Wallace. The main contest is between Wallace and Carter got some good news today in national polls. The latest Gallup poll indicates that if the election were held today, Carter would beat Ford. The poll also indicates that Ford would beat either Scoop Jackson or Hubert Humphrey. A poll made for Time magazine shows Ford beating Carter, but it also shows that Carter would run more strongly against Ford than any other Democrat. Carter was here in Chicago today, where he delivered an important speech on foreign policy. Judy Woodruff reports.
Carter told the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations that a president's primary responsibility is to guarantee the nation's security with a tough, muscular military force. Then he launched into a series of criticisms of U.S. foreign policy and of Secretary of State Kissinger.
Our foreign policy is full of details and nuances, probably known to one man only. That man is skilled at negotiation with leaders of other countries, but far less concerned with consulting the American people or the representatives in Congress. When our President and Secretary of State speak to the world without the understanding or support of the American people, they speak with an obviously hollow voice.
Carter said Kissinger has been trying to fool the country about détente.
The American people were told it would mean a generation of peace at no risk to the nation's vital interests. And yet, in places like Syria or Angola, in activities like offensive missile development, the Soviets seem to be taking advantage of a new relationship to expand their power and influence and increase the risk of conflict. I support the objectives of détente, but I cannot go along with the way it has been handled by Presidents Nixon and Ford.
Carter said the Soviets have moved from a position of weakness to a position of ascendancy in military strength. He said that the Americans have lost in almost every diplomatic negotiation made in the last few years. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, Chicago.
There are no believable predictions on the outcome of the Democratic contest tomorrow. The two biggest vote-getters are expected to be Jimmy Carter and George Wallace. Wallace held a press conference in Chicago today. He didn't say he would win, but he does expect a respectable vote. Wallace is still supplying some of the sharpest political language of the campaigns. He was asked again today about his health. He said he's in fine shape. Then he paused and said, "I'm only paralyzed in my legs. Some of these folks are paralyzed in their heads." However Wallace does here tomorrow, he is likely to pick up some delegates. There are two presidential races here in Illinois, one for delegates and another for popular support, a beauty contest. John Hart of our staff has taken a careful look at the Illinois primary, which is a very important primary this year.
Illinois figures, it is America, all in this one place, as typical of the country as a state can be. Here are the farmers who keep on pouring grain to us and sending meat to us. Here is the worked earth, interrupted by old country roads. And here is Chicago, and the blacks and the Irish and the Poles and the others who work the factories and the rail yards and the offices. This is the biggest primary state so far, with the fourth largest delegation to the National Convention. 155 delegates to be selected on Tuesday. But only half of the candidates for president are running here. And Jimmy Carter cannot win the delegate primary. He has only half a slate of delegates. He's running mainly in the popularity primary for a psychological victory.
Here we go, Wallace. Here we go.
George Wallace has the opportunity to win more delegates than Carter because he has more of them running, but not a full slate either. He's here for the popularity contest, too.
Hi, I'm Fred Harris.
As is Fred Harris, with only half a slate running and who is leaving the state now to campaign in Pennsylvania. And Sergeant Shriver, who has almost no delegates on the ballot and is hoping against hope not to come in last in the beauty contest. The real primary in Illinois is between two men who are not running for president. Between the man in the State House, Governor Dan Walker, who has delegates on every ballot.
I don't want Daley bossing that delegation.
And the man in Chicago, Mayor Richard Daley, who's determined Walker won't boss it either.
Well, I don't think his chances are very good on March the 16th. They won't be good for the National Convention.
But the main fight is over the governor's job. Walker is running for the nomination again, and Daley is trying to stop him.
Money against the machine. My point is that Mayor Daley can be mayor of the city of Chicago, but he should not run state government.
Daley doesn't like the word machine.
And I have no apology to make to anyone for the regime of the city of Chicago for the last 21 years.
The man the regime is running for governor is Michael Howlett, Secretary of State, who has taken to describing Walker as a jalopy.
And the reason that that's a good term, a jalopy's a worn-out car. And all that comes out of the exhaust is dirt.
The dirt is Walker's charge that Howlett was on the private payroll of a steel company for 15 years of his public life. As a result, Howlett got off the payroll.
What the hell? It's no campaign. I thought in a democracy we should intelligently discuss the issue. Not one issue and charge after charge. This is the worst campaign I've seen.
Daley's campaign is the organization. Precinct workers are bussed into rallies, handed signs, and ushered into the presence of the mayor and his slate. City Hall has seen hard times lately. 7 Chicago aldermen have gone to jail. So have 54 Chicago policemen, 85 employees of the Board of Elections. No scandal has touched the mayor himself. He is 73 years old, had a stroke a year and a half ago, and is holding on.
struggle for power, isn't it, Mr. Mayor?
No, I'm not interested in power. Hell, I'm interested. I'm tickled that I'm alive. I was pretty sick a year and a half ago.
So this is a presidential primary? It is in Illinois, where half the Democratic candidates stayed away, because here the mayor is simply more important than they are. John Hart, NBC News, Chicago. And among those candidates who did campaign here, there was this expression of the importance of the Illinois primary. 6 nationally known politicians spent, all told, a total of more than 50 days campaigning in the state at a total cost of $1,850,000. David Brinkley will have some political thoughts later in the program. The Illinois primary, which takes place tomorrow, is only one out of 30 presidential primaries this year. Never before have we had so many. And it is at least a curiosity that despite all of these popularity contests, the choice of one nominee may be made in a hotel room by a lot of politicians smoking cigars. David Brinkley has been thinking about this.
Here in Illinois and other states, a lot of voters might ask if the Democrats intend to choose their nominee in a smoke-filled room at their convention in New York, why all these primaries? Why all the handshaking, speechifying, money spending, rented airplanes, television commercials? And it's a good question. Already about 10 states have or talk of having delegates committed to favorite sons. That is, politicians not actually running for president, but who will arrive at the convention with delegates committed to them, which they could use like poker chips to get into the big game in the back room and choose the nominee. The list of states with favorite sons is growing fast. Senator Stevenson in Illinois, Governor Brown in California, Congressman Rodino in New Jersey, Senator John Glenn in Ohio. Jimmy Carter may feel they're ganging up on him to stop him from winning the nomination in the primaries before the convention opens. And it is true that a great many state and local party chairmen have not exactly lost their hearts to him. He is not what you would call a party regular. He has not spent a great deal of time sitting around drinking and lollygagging with the boys. And so they are not too familiar with him, and he may be a little independent for their tastes. And if he should win the nomination in the primaries, he could, as president, owe them nothing and ignore them. Party organizations nowadays are weak, but they're not dead, and they want to have something to say about who is nominated and not have the primaries take it entirely away from them. And so it could easily turn out that after 30 primaries and all the fuss, the nominee will be chosen in a back room full of politicians and smoke. John?
And that's it from Chicago this evening. The election is tomorrow, and we'll be here to cover it all. Until then, good night.
Almost everyone are reporting from the NBC News Center in New York.
Good evening. There were smiles at the White House and frowns in California today as Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford went over the results of yesterday's Illinois presidential primary. Ford won a smashing 59% of the vote. Reagan got 40%, which he had forecast. But however that 40% is seen, it's a blow to the Reagan campaign since he has now lost every one of his head-to-head contests with the president. And there was talk at the White House that it might be time now for Ronald Reagan to pull out. Tom Brokaw reports.
President Ford said today it's up to Reagan to decide when to get out of the race, but the president did apply some subtle pressure. He made it clear he believes a long struggle for the nomination will only divide Republicans. Mr. Ford made his remarks about Reagan during an interview with Bill Walker of station WSOC-TV in Charlotte, North Carolina.
The initiation, on the one hand, of any action under these circumstances, I think, has to come by a Reagan announcement concerning whatever he wants to do. In the meantime, we have to conduct ourselves so that we don't tear the party apart and develop long-standing differences.
NBC News has learned that Rogers Morton, a veteran of National Republican Party politics, now will become chairman of the President Ford Campaign Committee. Morton has been working on politics out of the White House. He'll move over to the campaign headquarters and the old job of Howard Bo Calloway. Callaway is on leave following reports that he used political influence to expand his ski resort. Stuart Spencer will continue to run the day-to-day organization of the Ford Committee. As chairman, Morton is expected to be active in trying to get Reagan out of the race. He has already been in touch with Republicans friendly with Reagan. Today, Morton joined the president in saying that the decision was up to Reagan, but in one way or another, the message has been sent. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, Washington.
And with 99% of the precincts reporting, here's how it came out in Illinois for the president. Ford, 450,000 votes, 59%. Reagan, 307,000 votes, 40%, which is what Reagan said he'd get. And America First candidate Laura Daley, 7,000 votes, 1%. The NBC News analysis of these results, based on a poll of almost 3,000 voters yesterday, shows us that Reagan did badly because he is seen as an extremist by some voters, as he has been in other states. But for the first time in Illinois, Gerald Ford is seen as a winner in the November presidential election. All of which could pose more problems for Ronald Reagan in next Tuesday's primary election in North Carolina. Don Oliver of our staff has been traveling with Reagan, and he was with him today in Los Angeles.
Reagan did not want to be questioned last night about the defeat in Illinois. He stayed at his home in Pacific Palisades, but his office issued a statement in which he said he was not discouraged and still thinks he has a 50-50 chance of winning the Republican nomination. It wasn't until this afternoon, as Reagan was preparing to fly off for campaigning in North Carolina, that reporters were able to question him about his latest defeat.
Governor Reagan, if you should sustain a large loss next week in the North Carolina primary, would you rethink your candidacy? If it were a margin similar to yesterday's?
Well, I don't think it's going to be a margin similar to yesterday's. I don't know whether we would or not, because what I think has been established so far is that almost half the Republican Party, in areas where I don't particularly have strength, have indicated that they'd like to have a choice. And with that in mind, we know that there is certainly greater strength in our view down the line, beginning in the May primaries that will be taking place then.
As he left California today, the pressure was on Reagan as it had not been before. Produce a victory in North Carolina or get out of the race. Don Oliver, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign en route to North Carolina.
President Ford has not ruled out the possibility of Reagan as a running mate, but today, Vice President Rockefeller said Reagan would bring in the votes of only a fraction of conservatives in the Republican Party, which is already a minority party. And here's how they stand today. On delegates, President Ford has an estimated 166 delegates. Reagan has 54, and there are 51 Republican delegates listed as uncommitted. Here in Illinois today, the voters were passing judgment on 6 presidential candidates and electing delegates to the Republican and Democratic national conventions. The weather was mixed. Good in Chicago, not so good early in the day in the southern part of the state. That is good news for the Daily Machine in Chicago, whose supporters would go out in typhoons or sandstorms to cast their votes. Not so good for other organizations with less disciplined voters. The turnout in Chicago and Cook County at midday was about 45%. In the rest of the state, it was lower, about 35%. President Ford's organization had from 300 to 400 telephones in use today. Ronald Reagan's people were on 400 phones asking people to vote. Both campaigns hope to reach all their potential voters today. There is no party registration in Illinois, which makes it easy for Republicans to vote in Democratic primaries and vice versa. This offers an opportunity for mischief, and the voters are, in fact, often mischievous in Illinois primaries.
I brought my little paper with me, so I hope everybody will want it.
But among those certain to vote the straight Democratic ticket is His Honor, Richard J. Daley, who takes no chances. He votes, then prays in church.
How's it going? All right. Good.
Daley is so popular that people get his autograph at the polling booth.
We hope a large number of people will turn out to show their interest in elections. This is one of the few countries left in which people can decide who they want as a candidate.
Who do you think will win the presidential primaries tonight?
In Illinois?
Yes.
The best man.
The best man.
See ya.
The only presidential candidate on the ballot in Illinois who is here for the results is Sargent Shriver. He used to live in Chicago and is hoping for a little help from his friends in the Daley organization. Ronald Reagan was in California. President Ford was in Washington, where his press secretary issued a ritual announcement that Mr. Ford thinks it may be closer than some other people think. Ford is expected to win. Fred Harris was in Texas. George Wallace was campaigning in North Carolina. Jimmy Carter was in Washington, lunching with the Washington Post, seeing blacks and labor people. Carter is leading in the polls here. Congressman Mo Udall of Arizona, the leading Democratic liberal candidate, is not on the ballot here. Udall was in Wisconsin, a state traditionally hospitable to liberals, and it holds its primary in 3 weeks. Charles Quinn has been traveling with Udall.
Morris Udall has campaigned longer and harder in Wisconsin than any other candidate. The primary on April 6th is critical to his chances for the Democratic nomination.
I'd like to give you a check. Hey, look at that. Small token. Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Udall came in second in New Hampshire, second in Massachusetts, so he feels that he must win here if he is to remain a serious candidate. Udall has changed his tactics from the earlier primaries. He now claims that he is the sole liberal candidate left in the race, the sole heir to the support of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. So he is shifting much of his attention to blue-collar voters and to blacks, groups that he largely ignored in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. He knows that he must broaden his base beyond the cocktail party and campus crowd if he is to win.
Are you going to be for busing, or are you going to be against busing? That's what it came down to. And of all of the candidates in this race in Massachusetts, I was the only one who's still around who said, I'm for enforcing constitutional rights.
Udall has plenty of work to do in Wisconsin. A recent newspaper poll put him fourth in the race. He plans to spend 8 more days and $250,000 in the state. Despite the newspaper poll, the Udall people here are terribly confident he will win. Udall himself says that if he doesn't come in first, he'll be disappointed. That it would be a setback, he says. But it could amount to much more than that. Wisconsin has a reputation for being a progressive state. Udall claims he's the only progressive left in the race. So if Udall can't win in Wisconsin, some people will start asking, where can he win? Charles Quinn, NBC.
This program is coming to you this evening from Chicago, the domain of Richard J. Daley, mayor and chairman of the Central Committee of the Cook County Democratic Party. Dick Daley's Chicago is organized politically better than any big city in the country, and his troops were out today reaping a harvest of votes. David Brinkley has some thoughts on the Daley organization. David?
Here in Chicago today, we could see in operation the last big city political machine left in America. It is beginning to squeak and rattle, but it's still a machine, and up to a point, it still works. Generations of political science professors have lectured on the evils of machine politics. Corrupt, they say, and usually they have been. But a good case can be made that a tight political organization or machine, kept reasonably clean, is the best and perhaps the only effective way to run a big modern city. The idea is simple. Every ward or block has a captain from the machine. If a householder needs a city license or a permit or a hole fixed in the street, he calls his own block captain and he delivers it promptly. What he wants in return for this service is your vote. Well, now, in a city with a nice, liberal, reform government, you have to take the day off and go down to City Hall and stand in line. And if the civil servant inside will leave his coffee and donuts long enough to talk to you, he will say, this is the wrong window, that the right window is a half a mile away, but it's closed on Wednesdays. That city machines have been corrupt does not mean that they have to be. Our reform governments aren't always so immaculate. Tammany Hall never drove New York City into bankruptcy. The idea of machine government is one that reform governments seem to have forgotten. That its only purpose is to serve not the coffee drinkers and donut dunkers idling around the City Hall, but to serve the public. And if the machine gets votes in return for services rendered, that is a better deal than most city dwellers get now.
None of this works in Chicago without votes. Votes are the stuff upon which our mayor feeds. And his minions were out in the wards and precincts at dawn today getting out the vote. John Hart was with them. It's 5:45 in the morning at the 17th Ward headquarters. Precinct workers are getting sample ballots.
Place as a voter approaches, you would give him one of these palm cards, ask him.
And palm cards with the name of a candidate the machine is pushing and his place on the ballot. It is quite legal for voters to carry the sample ballots and palm cards which they receive 100 feet from the door into the voting booth. And it is quite helpful to the organization.
People who are undecided will make up their mind the last minute. And if you put something in their hands the last minute, they will usually respond to it.
17th Ward.
It is 6 in the morning now, and precinct captains are calling ward headquarters to say the voting machines are working. And so are the people with the sample ballots and palm cards.
Hi, Dr. Burris.
Okay, fine.
All of them shouting 59A all the way to the right and works back this way.
I know.
Okay,
Right.
I know you do. How's everything going?
Right, good.
You looking good? I like that jacket. Don't lay it down anywhere.
Over in the 32nd precinct, Anna Smith, the precinct captain, is getting out the votes and bringing them to the polls. That is her car and her husband driving it, and they do this all day. Inside, officials of the Elections Board watch out for the voting machines, and as many as 3 officials of the organization watch out for the daily machine. Irving Payne is responsible to the ward leader for the votes of 6 precincts. The voting machine registers the turnout of Democrats and Republicans, which is not the same as counting votes, but given the Democratic loyalty here, it is very nearly the same.
The name of this game is hustling on the street. If you don't have hustlers out here talking to people, convincing people, forget it. 87 total.
Throughout the day, Payne keeps a running count of the turnout and calls it in. So, by 6 p.m. when the polls close, the daily machine knows how well the organization and how well the practiced hustle has worked.
For the 54th precinct, 76 total. 73 Democratic, 3 Republican.
John Hart, NBC News, Chicago. That's it for now. During the evening, we'll have special reports on the winners, and at 11:30, 10:30 Central and Mountain Time, we'll have a special half-hour report on the Illinois primary. Until then, good night from Chicago for NBC News. Jimmy Carter's big win yesterday in the Democratic primary in Illinois damaged George Wallace's campaign and forced Sergeant Shriver nearly out of the race. Here are nearly complete results. Carter, 621,000 votes, 48%. Wallace, 356,000 votes, 28%. Shriver, 207,000 votes, 16%. And Fred Harris of Oklahoma, who didn't campaign much, only 8%. Which means that so far this year, Jimmy Carter has won an estimated 123 delegates. The Illinois slate of Senator Adlai Stevenson and Mayor Daley has 85. George Wallace, 61 delegates. Scoop Jackson has 51. Mo Udall, 23. Mike Mansfield, the Senate Democratic leader, today described Carter as a very formidable contender for the nomination. Carter was contending in New York today, and with him was Judy Woodruff.
At 8 o'clock this morning, Carter was the main attraction at Grand Central Station. He came to shake hands, but few people actually reached him because of the crush of photographers. Talking with reporters, Carter appeared to eliminate both Udall and Humphrey as serious challengers for the nomination.
I don't see any prospect of Humphrey being a major factor in the Democratic Party presidential election. But I can't imagine Humphrey running against Jackson, and he's announced repeatedly that he will not enter any primaries. I think for all practical purposes, the race has now evolved down between myself and Senator Jackson.
Carter continued today to try to improve his support among liberals. For the second day in a row, he met with influential black leaders.
In over 100 years.
Carter said it's particularly important for him to win a majority of black voters because he is from the South.
And the possible concern in the minds of many people in this country that a Southerner might have racial animosities is a very serious political handicap. And for me to have
Carter won more than 60% of the black vote in Illinois. The St. Patrick's Day parade in New York gave him another opportunity to be seen. His national campaign manager says there are no plans to change strategy because of Carter's string of successes. He didn't mention it, but the Carter camp may face a delicate problem: how to run ahead of Jackson, but not knock him out of the race entirely, and thus tempt Hubert Humphrey to jump in early. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, New York.
If Jimmy Carter believes that only he and Scoop Jackson are the only real contenders for the Democratic nomination, Hubert Humphrey has other ideas. Catherine Mackin has that story.
This is how Hubert Humphrey is campaigning for president without ever leaving the United States Senate. He says all the issues the American people are concerned about are before the Senate. In Washington, in the past week alone, he has spoken before 12 organizations. This is one of them, a meeting of the National Conference of Mayors. When he talks, he sounds like a campaigner, frequently knocking the way President Ford is handling the economy.
Well, I believe that there's some recovery underway, but it's not exactly the smash hit of the decade right now, you know. It's kind of easing up on us, but it's not rushing into the act. Thank you. I still think you'd be the best man for the president. Thank you. Why don't we go all the way? Thank you very much. Humphrey is 76. My friend.
Humphrey says he is getting lots of pressure from Democratic leaders, governors, and members of Congress to announce for president. He says he is sometimes tempted to do it. But his plan is to wait. Humphrey doesn't think there is a Democratic frontrunner yet. And in an interview today, he said that if nobody seems to sew up the nomination during the primaries, then he will try to get it.
If it looks like it's going to go to the convention, then I would think that it would be prudent and wise on my part, knowing that my name has been in the news, knowing that I've been in the polls. It would only be really just prudent and sensible to take a good look to see where my people are, to see what the chances are, and put it together.
The trouble with Humphrey's strategy, which doesn't include an official announcement or running in any of the primaries, is that it's a gamble. He might wake up the day after the June 8th California primary and find that somebody else already has the Democratic nomination all wrapped up. Catherine Mackin, NBC News, Washington.
We asked a question about Humphrey yesterday in our poll of Illinois voters. Remember, Carter got 48% of the Illinois vote. But if Humphrey had been running in Illinois, Carter would have got only 37% of the vote, and Humphrey would have come in second there with 31%. That's an indication of Humphrey's appeal. In our analysis of Carter's appeal in Illinois, we found it wide. He appealed to liberals, conservatives, and especially to moderates. We also found that Carter is getting a growing share of the anti-Washington vote, which used to go to George Wallace. Carter meets Wallace. We're reporting from New York this evening, having been in Chicago last night on the presidential primary story. There's something about Chicago which stays in the memory, like the cool breeze off the lake or the smell of the stockyards on a summer night. John Hart of our staff stayed behind to take a look at some of the local races, and here is his report.
Green dye for the Chicago River. Celebration for the Irish, and most especially for the Irish mayor, whose influence is flowing from Chicago to the state capitol. All the machine's statewide candidates won. There was a defeat for the mayor, a significant one. Congressman Ralph Metcalf beating the machine's candidate in the 1st Congressional District better than 2-1 for renomination. Metcalf's issue was the daily organization and the treatment of blacks by police. More than a third of the city's blacks live in the district, which turned against Daley for the first time in the 21 years he's been mayor. An important rebellion, which Daley in public did not acknowledge.
The people spoke, and when the people speak, that's really when it happens. You win them and you lose them. It's like playing. It's like that's good. Yeah. You smile. The big contest was in the gubernatorial, and that was the ball game. The other was a little game going on the side there. And we meet you all at the parade at 1 o'clock, and we'll meet you after the parade if you're going to stop someplace.
Daley had settled some old scores. He beat Governor Walker, who had called the 1968 Democratic Convention here a police riot. and he won control of the delegation to this year's convention. As the mayor says, it's a political parade. John Hart, NBC News, Chicago.
And good night for NBC News. The senator from Idaho became the 8th Democrat now in the race for the party's presidential nomination. Don Harris was with Church when he made his announcement.
Somehow, Idaho City seems an unlikely place to announce that you're going to run for the presidency of the United States. It's still winter in this mountain town, and normally less than 200 people live here. Idaho Senator Frank Church said he chose this former gold mining town to make the announcement because this is where his grandfather settled after the Civil War, the town where his father was born. Perhaps 2,000 people came to Idaho City this morning. They made the 40-mile drive from Boise to hear their state senior senator formally announce his campaign. Church began by saying the Nixon and Ford administrations were motivated by fear.
It is a leadership of weakness and fear that produces enemy lists of American citizens whose only offense is that of disagreeing with presidential policy. It is a leadership of weakness and fear that grants a full pardon to a former president for whatever crimes he committed in the White House, but looks the other way while his subordinates stand by.
The senator from Idaho said he could not enter the presidential campaign earlier because of his Senate investigations of the CIA, the FBI, and the Internal Revenue Service. He also said he doesn't believe he's starting too late.
So to those who say it's too late, I reply that it's never too late to try, nor are the odds ever too great. That was the spirit with which the West was won, and in that spirit, I now formally declare my candidacy for the office of President of the United States.
The first primary for Frank Church will be in Nebraska on May 11th. His campaign manager flatly predicts Church will win there. Don Harris, NBC News, Idaho City.
President Ford told a group of newspaper editors today that the longer Ronald Reagan battles him in the primaries, the greater the chance of a divided Republican Party next November. The president said that because there are fewer Republicans than there are Democrats, the GOP cannot afford such a division. Mr. Ford made his remarks as Reagan was campaigning in North Carolina, and a reporter asked Reagan what he thought the president meant.
Do you understand this to be an invitation to get out of the race?
Well, what's different about that?
No.
They've been saying that since... yes, of course. And I have no intention of getting out of the race. I don't think that there's anything divisive in a legitimate primary contest any more than there is in the Democratic Party. I might point out also to Mr. Ford and some of those who seem to be so nervous about my candidacy that are they suggesting that the almost half the Republican Party that has indicated they do want a choice in an open primary, that they should be disenfranchised, that their views should not be considered?
Republican Governors Evans of Washington and Holshouser of North Carolina issued statements today calling for Reagan to get out of the race. They listed 7 other Republican governors who they said share their views, but 2 of those listed governors said they had not signed the statement. Many black voters feel that they have been all but ignored by presidential candidates during this primary season, so black activists are meeting in Cincinnati trying to organize their own party. As Mike Jackson reports, some of the rhetoric at the 3rd Black Political Convention is pretty strong.
What are we doing to make sure that by the year 2000, we do not once again have an all-white Congress of the United States devoted to the maintenance of white supremacy and black degradation?
Like this woman, delegates to the convention fear blacks are in danger of losing much they gained in the civil rights struggles of the 60s. The feeling here is that both the Democratic and Republican parties have drifted to the political right, and that the only way blacks can influence politics now is to start a third party movement based on a different philosophy.
There are too many giant multinational corporations and families that gobble up all the wealth.
and that a new society must be created in which we have the principles of economic democracy, where the people begin to control the economic systems, but the goods and services are distributed not on the basis of what is most profitable to some, but what is best in human terms for the many.
The strength of this third-party movement will not be shown until November. Members of the Black Political Assembly hope to come up with as many as 5 to 10 million votes. If not enough to elect a third-party president, then enough to influence the National Republican and Democratic Party policies.
We must become in the same kind of political bargaining power that the Irish have been in this country, that the Jews are now in this country. There's tremendous support for Israel. Why? Not because the masses of fascist whites in this country care about Israel, but because the Jews have solidified their political power.
This is the third Black Political Convention. As it did twice before, it will write a national black agenda. But this time, with the agenda, will be a plan for a show of strength to challenge the professional politicians, who these amateurs feel have not answered the needs of black Americans. Mike Jackson, NBC News.
Chancellor and David Brinkley reporting from the NBC Election Center in New York.
Good evening. The first scattered votes are in today's North Carolina presidential primary. Let's see what we've got on the boards for the Democrats. These are only absentee ballots, 175 for Carter, 62 for George Wallace, 29 for Morris Udall, and 24 for Scoop Jackson. That's all so far. And with President Ford and Ronald Reagan running on the Republican side, we find 75 absentee ballots counted so far for President Ford and 58 for Ronald Reagan. We don't know if it'll come out that way in the end. Earlier today, President Ford's people said they would be happy with a modest victory. Ronald Reagan's camp vowed to fight on, win or lose, and among the Democrats, George Wallace said he'd stay in the race, win or lose. Carter didn't say. It was a flawless spring day in North Carolina, but despite the beautiful weather, state officials predicted a light to moderate turnout. There are 6 Democrats on the ballot, but only Carter and Wallace have campaigned in the state. There are 61 Democratic delegates at stake and 54 Republican delegates up today. If Jimmy Carter does well in the North Carolina primary, one reason may be that he will get most of the black vote. Carter won many black votes in Massachusetts and in Florida this year, and he's been working on black voters in North Carolina. Tom Pettit has been looking into that.
Jimmy Carter seems to be the first white candidate since Robert Kennedy who can establish rapport with blacks.
Jimmy Carter has become better known. Questions have been asked about his religion. He's a Southern Baptist. Particular attention has been paid to his statement that he underwent a profound religious experience in 1967 when he would have been about 42 years old. He was asked about that last week.
But in 1967, I realized that my own relationship with God, with Christ, was a very superficial one. And because of some experiences I had that I won't describe, involving personal witnessing in states outside of Georgia among people who were very unfortunate, many of whom could not speak English, and I formed a very close, intimate, personal relationship with God through Christ that has given me a great deal of peace, equanimity, the ability to accept difficulties without unnecessarily being disturbed, and also an inclination on a continuing basis to ask God's guidance in my life.
A member of Carter's staff told us that this took place in Philadelphia while Carter was on a Baptist church mission among poor Spanish-speaking people. We have checked on the religious meaning of Carter's profound experience. It is described by other Baptists as a common experience, not something out of the ordinary. To Baptists and members of certain other religions, having a profound religious experience, being reborn, does not mean having a vision or hearing the voice of God. And Carter says it does not involve a divine endorsement for a presidential candidate. David Brinkley's Journal tonight deals with 2 Republicans who are running in today's North Carolina primary, Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford. David?
Great tradition of American politics, using the public's money to persuade the public. And this list of goodies has been scattered like free ice cream cones over New Hampshire, Florida, and Illinois. Reagan nor anyone else can match it, and he knows it. And so he keeps saying that when the president arrives in a town to campaign, the band should not play Hail to the Chief, but should play Santa Claus is Coming to Town. John? From the NBC News Center in New York, and David Brinkley's Journal from Washington.
Good evening. Politicians around the country today were going over the returns from the Republican presidential primary in North Carolina, in which Ronald Reagan, who'd been President Ford's sparring partner in earlier primaries, turned into a slugger with a punch. The final tally, Reagan with 52% of the vote. The first time this year he's been over 50%. Ford with 46%, his lowest showing so far. Mr. Ford was at the White House wondering what hit him. Reagan was in California planning new strategy. Here are two reports.
Reagan was in North Carolina for 5 straight days just before the primary. Voters who'd been undecided said that made a difference to them. Voter polls also showed his campaign against Kissinger and détente got him votes among the generally conservative North Carolina Republicans. As the votes were being counted last night, the candidate was on his plane, joking and enjoying himself, but refusing to discuss politics with reporters. Cameramen were not allowed to record sound on the plane. When he arrived in Los Angeles, Reagan had only a brief statement.
I think it indicates that the issues that we've been trying to talk about are beginning to catch on. We're going to continue the campaign and continue talking about the issues, and I hope as we continue that we can have a discussion of them.
For a winner, Reagan was very non-committal. He plunged into a crowd of well-wishers, but refused again to answer any reporter's questions. The former California governor will remain at his Los Angeles home until Saturday. To the surprise of his Wisconsin supporters, he has canceled all campaign appearances next week and is seeking a half an hour of national television time during that period.
Governor, can you give us any indication about what you plan to say in your national television speech?
This one I have to fall back on no comment. No, we just have to wait for that one.
One Reagan advisor said it will be the definitive speech of the campaign, outlining where he thinks the U.S. stands in the world today. Reagan may plan a major new policy statement in his TV appearance, or it is possible, in view of all the no comments and the secrecy, that the Reagan forces are just trying to inject a little mystery into their campaign. Don Oliver, NBC News, Los Angeles.
President Ford still is trying to determine how much he was hurt by Reagan's attacks on administration defense policies. It was obviously on his mind when he talked with visiting Republicans today.
We expected to win. We didn't. And I might say that in politics, it's never good to come in second. And just as I said, I get no solace out of being number 2 in any election. I can assure you that the United States is going to be number 1 as it is in our national security.
These Dallas Republicans will be important to President Ford in the Texas primary May 1st. Defense policy will still be an issue, and Reagan still can be expected to keep up his criticism. Criticism White House political strategist Rogers Morton believes is not fair.
Either he's misinformed or he is using an issue which in a sense is a straw man, because the president has not only a record as president, but for 25 years in Congress has been a great advocate of the strongest possible defense. I would hope that instead of criticizing the president, we would all get behind him so that we can be assured of a top-flight defense mechanism.
Morton will be taking over President Ford's campaign committee shortly, replacing Howard Bo Callaway, now on temporary leave while he's under investigation for improper use of political influence. Callaway is expected to quit tonight. If he doesn't quit, according to White House sources, President Ford will ask for his resignation. Tom Brokaw, NBC News at the White House.
Across town in Washington at Reagan's national headquarters, the word today was that Reagan will not campaign heavily in the next primaries, New York and Wisconsin, but will concentrate his efforts on the Texas primary. Scoop Jackson is waiting for him, and in Wisconsin, where Mo Udall is waiting for him. George Wallace's defeat yesterday by Carter has made Wallace a lesser factor. Carter won decisively in North Carolina with 54% of the vote. Wallace got 35%. Scoop Jackson didn't campaign. Wallace was in Alabama today revising his strategy. He hasn't won a primary yet, and today more than 30 members of his campaign staff lost their jobs. Kenley Jones of our staff is with Wallace.
When Wallace arrived at a news conference last night, he told reporters, "Sorry I'm late, I've been waiting for the rural vote." That small joke said a lot about what's wrong with the Wallace campaign. In 1972, Wallace got 70% of the rural white vote in the North Carolina primary. This year, he got only 40%. But despite erosion of his hardcore conservative support, Wallace says he will press on.
Mr. Reagan finally won one today, evidently, and maybe I'll win one next time. Some of the polls in Wisconsin have shown me doing very well.
Some major changes are being made in the Wallace strategy. There will be more of this, personal campaigning, Wallace pressing the flesh as he did on the last day of the North Carolina primary. And there will be less of this, the familiar Wallace rally featuring Grand Ole Opry stars. That will save money and free Wallace to spend more time on television. Another change will be an appeal for conservative volunteer workers.
The hardcore conservative element of this country, who has been with the governor in the past and expected the governor to be their champion and their leader, has somewhat set aside now. And they have apathy to the point that they're not really that concerned about what's going on and whatnot, but that concern is going to pick up.
But some staff members are concerned that no matter what they do, Wallace may be unable to appeal beyond his hardcore conservative support, even if he can stop the erosion there, to put together a winning margin of votes. One staff member agreed that it may be like fishing for whales in a goldfish bowl. The votes simply aren't there. Ken Lee Jones, NBC News, Montgomery, Alabama.
And so here's where we stand as far as delegates are concerned. Mr. Ford picked up 25 North Carolina delegates yesterday for a total of 199. Reagan's North Carolina. The United States is ready to talk to North Vietnam on all issues relating to both countries. Secretary Kissinger. Most politics in this country today was Democratic politics. The candidates in next month's primaries in New York and Wisconsin were in New York and Wisconsin today. Former Senator Fred Harris, one of the Democratic candidates, said he thinks the Ford administration is preparing to blockade the island of Cuba. Jimmy Carter and Mo Udall were in Wisconsin. Senator Henry Jackson was in New York. And Jackson was gathering labor support in both states. He has so far been endorsed by 1/3 of the members of the AFL-CIO Executive Council, and we've learned he'll get more of those endorsements from labor people who say they will not wait for Hubert Humphrey to become an active candidate. At the same time, Udall has some labor support of his own in Wisconsin. Here are two reports.
These are local union leaders in New York, brought together today by Jackson organizers in an effort to make sure the rank and file work for their candidate between now and the April 6th primary here. There are dozens of meetings like this these days, called by state and national labor leaders supporting Henry Jackson.
But if you do nothing else, notify your membership of Senator Jackson's need for votes on April 6th.
Labor is determined this year to get somebody nominated who will be friendly to the unions. AFL-CIO board member Edward Carlo, who heads the sheet metal workers union, says that means Henry Jackson.
There won't be an opportunity for Senator Humphrey. One of the candidates now running is going to get the nomination. For the past month, there have only been two choices for the American labor movement: Henry Jackson or Jimmy Carter. And the American labor movement has to go to Scoop Jackson.
Jackson has already piled up an impressive list of labor endorsements. Appearing with him at this news conference were the heads of the garment workers, longshoremen's, seafarers, paper workers unions, and others. All of these endorsements are important, not only because they influence votes, but because the unions can provide free manpower, and they can empty their treasuries writing and calling their members, telling them to vote for Jackson. And that kind of help is also critical in Jackson's Wisconsin campaign. He will spend only 2.5 days in the state before the primary, most of that with labor, and he won't spend much on advertising. He is counting on labor to lead his campaign there.
But as I look around this room, we have the representatives of the unions that can make the difference here in the state of Wisconsin.
Jackson believes he has 80% of Wisconsin's labor leaders behind him.
All of this will make a significant difference for Jackson if labor's rank and file actually get out and work, something they did not do in 1968 or 1972. And though labor says it isn't waiting for Humphrey, if Jackson falters along the way, Humphrey will be at the convention waiting for labor. Bob Jameson, NBC News, with the Jackson campaign in New York.
Jackson is not the only candidate with labor support in Wisconsin. A liberal labor coalition of 20 unions, 230,000 members, has promised Morris Udall substantial backing. Udall says Jackson's support comes from older, more conservative unions while his people are younger, more inclined to be activists, like these United Auto Workers. Their leaders say these are the troops who will man the phone banks and spread the word that Udall should be the working man's candidate. Some observers say that in Wisconsin, organized labor is about evenly divided between Udall and Jackson. Can Udall's labor leaders sell him to the rank and file? One of his top men said they would work hard for him, but in the last analysis, he had to sell himself. Charles Quinn, NBC News, Janesville, Wisconsin.
Confirmed that today, adding that the offer has been made to North Vietnamese officials in Paris. One serious issue is that of the Americans missing in action in the Vietnam War. Another is the possibility of providing North Vietnam with money and help in the reconstruction of that country. For President Ford, the matter of North Vietnam is a highly sensitive political issue. He campaigned in California today, and John Cochran reports on how Mr. Ford handled it.
As the president arrived in California, White House aides were concerned that Republican conservatives may not like the idea of negotiating with the Vietnamese communists. Questioned by a reporter, Mr. Ford avoided talking about normalizing relations and emphasized instead that he wants to get an accounting of Americans still missing in action, and that he's following the recommendation of a congressional committee which recently visited Hanoi.
That congressional committee has come to the White House, talked with me, and urged that we undertake informal discussions primarily aimed at the MIA problem and anything that might relate to it. And that's the limit of the discussion so far. You do favor that? I certainly favor it if it can have any impact or beneficial result involving our MIA.
Mr. Ford gave no details, but administration sources say he prefers that the talks be held in Paris with the American delegation to be led by a middle-level State Department official. Appearing before campaign workers, Mr. Ford did not mention the Vietnamese, nor did he mention Ronald Reagan. But he denied Reagan's charges that he has allowed the United States to fall behind the Russians militarily. The president said it's the Democrats who are trying to cut spending on defense research and production, which is a big industry in California.
We will not play Russian roulette with so basic an issue.
Mr. Ford's closest political advisors feel that discontent with the administration's defense and foreign policies goes beyond issues, and that a lot of Republicans just don't like Henry Kissinger. Ford strategists don't know what to do about that, since the president says he has no intention of dumping his Secretary of State. John Cochran, NBC News, with the Ford campaign in San Francisco.
Also disputes Mr. Ford's claims of a solid economic recovery. On the Democratic side, Senator Henry Jackson campaigned another day in New York for next Tuesday's primary. For Jackson, New York is the big one. Bob Jameson reports.
One day this week, Henry Jackson went to the top of New York's World Trade Center and looked down on the city and the state as though he had already won the April 6th primary. Jackson expects to win here, and he must, because he has told everyone he will, and because of Jimmy Carter's string of victories. Jackson is aiming his campaign at groups favoring him, like organized labor, and New York's ethnic groups, particularly Jews, criticizing détente, an issue he believes is significant among all voters, no matter their religion or ties to other countries.
If there's nothing wrong with the concept of détente, but what is wrong is the idea that they can, the Soviet Union, run it the way they want.
And much of Jackson's rhetoric here is devoted to his early support of New York in its financial crisis.
I was the first one to come out for help to New York City when the other politicians said it was unpopular and they wouldn't have anything to do with it. I took the lead.
At the same time, he tells people Jimmy Carter opposed help for New York City. Carter's string of victories caused Jackson to adjust his New York strategy. He's spending more time upstate than he originally planned, because there is a feeling Carter may be gaining on him there. Jackson has increased the tempo of his attacks on Carter, saying he is already a poor loser before the primary.
I think what's happened to Jimmy Carter is that and history will record that in New York State he lost his smile.
At the same time he is doing all of this, Jackson is trying to make a respectable showing in Wisconsin, while spending only 2.5 days in that state and little money.
But he boasts strong labor support that generated this rally last night. He is counting on labor to carry his Wisconsin campaign. He makes no claims of victory. Jackson at one time was predicting a landslide victory in New York. Now he says he will win a majority, thus acknowledging Carter's growing strength and the danger of setting a target he might miss. Bob Jameson, NBC News, New York.
Jimmy Carter replied today to reports of a Stop Carter movement in Wisconsin. The New York Times reported this morning that Hubert Humphrey is quietly supporting Morris Udall in next Tuesday's Wisconsin primary to keep Carter from running off with a Democratic presidential nomination. Carter says he doesn't know if that story is true, but he said the American people, in his words, don't like that kind of maneuvering, and moves like that, he said, might cost the Democrats the election. Udall says he understands that it's in Humphrey's interest to support him now, to give Humphrey a chance to win the nomination at the convention. But Udall says he is nobody's stand-in, that he's out to win and expects to win himself. The Secretary of Commerce, Elliot Richardson, got an additional job today. President Ford named Richardson to head a 10-member task force. The task force will investigate overseas payoffs by American